everyone, my name is Janessa and I'm the Director of Student Ministries at Plattwoods UMC. So I have to admit that this time of year is actually kind of my least favorite time of year. Number one, Christmas is over and it's just sad because I love Christmas. But number two, everyone just constantly asking, what are your goals for this new year? What should we, what are you planning on doing? And I'm like, I have no idea. Normally the only resolution, I guess you could say, or goal I have for myself is a number of books I want to read for the year. Otherwise, I kind of have maybe smaller goals, not goals for the whole year, because I'm just not good at that. So do you have any goals or resolutions for this new year? Or are you like me and do smaller goals? Or maybe you're just I don't really know about goals this year. We'll see how the year pans out and then we'll maybe think about some goals. So maybe though, even if you don't have a big overarching goal, I'm willing to bet you have some maybe smaller goals for yourself. Maybe raise your grades or learn a new skill or get accepted into college or maybe get healthier, or maybe it's whatever, insert whatever goal you have right now here. So let's be honest for a second. When you're a teenager, setting goals can feel really overwhelming, especially if you're struggling to achieve or to set goals in the first place. Because you as a teenager, you're still figuring out what you even want to be. It's kind of hard to think that far into the future, and you don't even have total independence over your life or your time. So all of these things can make it difficult to set and to stick to goals, but I'm totally convinced that you and your generation are gonna change the world. And I'm not just talking about changing the future, I'm talking about right now, and it starts with goals that you set. So if you haven't guessed it already, we're gonna be talking about goals for the next month. So get something to write on, whether it's the notes app on your phone, something on your laptop, or a post-it note and pen and paper, whatever. Or maybe you're just gonna think about it real hard and just remember it. So, but I want you to write down a goal that you have, but not just any goal. Write down a big and bold and the greatest goal of all time kind of goal. So your ultimate goal, things what do you want to accomplish? What do you want to become? What do you want to contribute to the world? And if you're I don't really know, just put a big question mark. That's totally fine. Because in a bit, I'm going to ask you to think more about it and add to it or change it to make it more specific. So it doesn't have to be perfect right now. So over the next couple of weeks, we're going to talk about things what goals should I have for my life? What do my goals have to do with God, and how can I achieve my goals in the first place? So to do this, we're going to look at the book of Nehemiah. But first, a little backstory, because Nehemiah is kind of a lesser known book and he's a lesser known prophet in the Bible. So you can find the story of Nehemiah in the Old Testament, which is the part of the Bible before Jesus. So about 140 years before the book of Nehemiah was written, the Jewish people were conquered by an enemy army. And these people took control over the city of Jerusalem. So when they did this, they destroyed the city, they burned the temple, and they sent many of God's people into exile. Through prophets, God promised to restore and to rebuild the city of Jerusalem, and that God's people would return from the exile. But it was still a pretty bad loss for the Jewish people, because we're talking generations of heartbroken people over the loss of their city. So Nehemiah's story begins 140 years after Jerusalem was conquered, but Nehemiah had only known Jerusalem to be occupied by enemy armies, but he was passionate about seeing the city restored. So today we're going to look at Nehemiah chapter 1 through chapter 2, verse 5, but I'm just going to summarize because it's kind of long, but I encourage you to read this as a small group. So basically what happens is Nehemiah is talking to one of his friends, and they're talking about Jerusalem, and people are returning to the city, and Nehemiah sees the walls are still broken down and in shambles, and so Nehemiah is grieved by this and super upset. So he breaks down weeping and starts praying to God. It's what should I do? This is a huge problem. What's going on? And so finally Nehemiah is I'm gonna do something about this. So he starts to take kind of note about some resources that he has. I'm the cupbearer to the king. So when he goes and brings the king his drink, he the king asks what's going on? You seem a little upset. And so Nehemiah tells him, and the king says, if this is important to you, go. It's fine, just go. So basically Nehemiah figures out in this chapter that he has a really big goal, and it was inspired by a big problem because he knew Jerusalem had been destroyed because it was like old news. His whole life Jerusalem was destroyed. But his friend Hanani told him that the Jewish people were returning to the city, and Nehemiah sees this as a really big problem because there's a practical problem in all of this, that like without walls, the city is vulnerable to more attacks. So it's like this walls are in shambles. This is a big deal. And then you also have a spiritual problem because Jerusalem was so important to the Jewish people, and it was really connected to their relationship with God. So rebuilding the walls was super important because it was a way they could honor God. So obviously this is the beginning of Nehemiah's story, and so we can learn 3 things here about how his goal began. Number 1, his goal began with difficulty. Nehemiah didn't just like set a goal because he needed a cool New Year's resolution or like a new hobby. It's because he saw a problem and he believed he could solve it. And we know this goal mattered to him a lot because it says he broke down weeping and grieving as he identified this problem. So it wasn't going to just be a fun new hobby, it was going to be a way to honor God. Second, his goal began with prayer. As he wept, he was fasting and he was praying because Nehemiah knew this goal is so big he could not do it without God's help. Before he even took a single step to achieve this goal, he asked God for wisdom and guidance and help. So finally, number 3, you have Nehemiah's goal began with God's help. Because of the size of this goal, it forced Nehemiah to put all of his faith in a God who could do what Nehemiah couldn't. The book of Nehemiah starts off with like destruction and grief and loss and tears, but that's not where the story ends. Because when Nehemiah heard about these crumbling walls in Jerusalem, he discovered an important truth. Big difficulties can inspire God-sized goals. I think the story of Nehemiah can teach us a lot about setting goals for ourselves, because the whole story of Nehemiah is really about setting God-sized goals in our lives. So I want you to think about or look back at that goal that you wrote down earlier and ask these 3 questions. Number 1, is your goal inspired by a big difficulty? And I'm not talking about you setting a goal that like causes you difficulty. I'm thinking about hard things that are happening in your life or around you. Things like bullying or discrimination or racism, or maybe like health issues in your family. Because we often find like big God-sized goals or things we're passionate about in those difficulties in our lives. Like Nehemiah, our passions can so often be inspired by the difficulties we see or experience. Number 2, is your goal inspired by prayer? Have you talked to God about what you've written down? Or maybe you wrote down a question mark and you're just like, I don't really know what the goals are for my life. So maybe you need to start to ask God to open your eyes to things in your life, like the people or the needs around you. And then talk to someone about it. Like Nehemiah talked to Hanani, so like we should talk to wise people in our life, because wise people can help us set God-sized goals. So talk to someone like a parent, a small group leader, or a trusted adult in your life. And then finally, number 3, do you need God's help to accomplish your goal? This is a really important question to ask yourself if you want to see if your goal is big enough. If you think you can probably do your goal by yourself, dream bigger. So over the next couple weeks, we're going to continue to look at the book of Nehemiah, and we're going to hopefully discover what kind of goals God has in store for our lives. So this week, though, I want you to think about this question: what breaks my heart? Or maybe what should break my heart? And then how can you turn that into a God-sized goal in your life? Don't get me wrong, the question, what are the goals for my life, can be really scary. But instead of waiting around for inspiration or cues for what if we instead looked around for the problems and the needs in our world that need to be solved? Whether it's things that impact you or others or just our whole world in general, big difficulties can inspire God-sized goals. And I cannot wait to see what kind of goals God has in store for your life.